Okay, I guess we can start. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in this PhD seminar. This is the first talk we have this year. And Vanessa and Veronica are like third-year PhD students working in the applied machine learning group, you can say. And today they are talking about time series, generally, how some methods that we can apply to deal with such kind of data.
Thank you. Hi everybody. Thanks for the introduction. So the talk today is going to be. I'm sorry, I'm sick. Try. The talk today is basically a list of methods that we use, a list of pre-processing methods, feature extraction methods, learning methods. It's not, a recipe, you should do this. We don't know if it's appropriate for your problem. We would like to, you to interact with us and ask us questions and, make a dialogue out of it. And we are going to talk, a little bit of me, a little bit of her, so it's going to be complicated, but we'll try. This is a general introduction of the many things that we did. So the first one, okay. So I mainly work with graph inference that I will explain at the very end of the talk. So basically, I'm trying to understand correlations between variables in the system, and these variables change over time. And here is an example of how the variables interact over time, and what I'm trying to look for are events in the time series. And this is true here, and it's true also here, in which, in this plot, for example, we are analyzing financial data, and we are trying to detect events, and in this particular case, we are detecting the global crisis of 2007, 2008. Okay?
Yes, in my case, I'm working mostly with electrophysiological data from epileptic patients. So as you see above, there is this kind of acquisition, which are pretty invasive because they are signal acquired in the intracortical areas. And the main goal here is characterizing the epileptic regions. So one possible approach can be pattern inference, pattern recognition, and using dictionary learning over this time series, as you see in the middle plot. And in practice, what we mostly want to do is being able to see if there are different contributes in the time series.
Okay. So this is the outline. Basically, we are discussing some problems that we had to deal with when analyzing time series. And we are going to approach different parts of the analysis. The first part is mainly pre-processing and feature extraction, which doesn't involve machine learning methods. And in the other part, we are going to present some of the methods that we used. It's a very general overview, so if you have questions, you ask later. And then we give some conclusions and some take-home messages. Okay.
Can I ask some questions?
Sure.
So here you talk about time series, but what kind of time do you consider? Continuous time, discrete time? Do you want to abstract from time and just talk about before and after?
For me, it's like discrete, so I can never work with my methods on continuous time. I don't know,
I mean, in my case, the signal is continuous because they are electromagnetic waves, but at the end, you sample this signal by fixing a sampling frequency. So at the end, it's discrete.
So let's say, from a mathematical point of view, you think of something continuous, but then because of
digital limitations, if you want, yes. You deal with something discrete.
The signals that you consider, they are, I guess they take value very reals or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you consider also things that are more complicated, like fields where you have that at a given time you have a snapshot of a two-dimensional.
We don't deal with images.
No, not videos.
Yes.
Our analysis in general. It's an interesting point. Okay, so talking about problems, the first one is preprocessing. It's not a problem, but I mean it can be seen as a necessary step that we have to perform in order to solve tasks and to do it in a better way. And there are different kinds of noise. It's very nice if we are able to identify them in advance. So in these two cases, there are those two are noises related with again acquisition of continuous signal. In one case, we have the removal of baselines, and in the other, you can imagine to have in every kind of signal power line noise, so you have to remove it, the 50 hertz of contribution of the harmonics.
Okay. So another problem is that when you deal with multivariate systems, especially in time, if you're looking for events, let's say, it's not always immediate to distinguish between causation and correlation. This is an example that I found on the internet. So basically, what you will observe is that all these three variables are measured together, and all of them are correlated in some sense. But what you want to distinguish is between the cause, so the causation links, and the things that are correlated because of the causation links. And this is kind of complicated with time series because you also have to consider time and evolving.
The second, another point is interpretability. So when we analyze a time series, probably the information we look for is very sparse in the signal. And we would like to have an interpretable models in the sense that probably we are looking for specific patterns, as the one I reported in the bottom of the image, where when you have some recordings, especially in the case of brain recordings, probably you're interested in looking for spikes and a train of spikes. So what you want to have is, you would like to recover this information inside your model, which is not always the case.
The last point is more machine learning related, maybe. So basically, it's kind of difficult to take a method as a black box and apply it on data. This is always true, but let's say that if you have a classification problem, it's easier to do it. While if you're analyzing time series, there are many things that you have to consider. So for example, you may have methods that assume the data to be Gaussians. So you have to consider the distribution of data. Or for example, you're modeling, you're developing a method that considers specific interval of times to detect, I don't know, patterns. But if you want to change the length of the time interval, it can be it can cause problem in your specific problem, and this may also cause problem from the computational point of view. So most of the methods that you can find maybe are they work on 2 or 3 time series, or for, I don't know, 1 second time series, but if you give 10-second time series, everything crashes. So you have to consider all these things when analyzing data.
Okay, so focusing on the preprocessing, here is mostly what I've said before. So why it is fundamental? Because probably we want to extract information. We can do a priori before using machine learning. And preprocessing mostly consists of data cleaning, data reduction. So if we know that we are interested in, I don't know, some specific frequency, which are low, we can get rid of the highest by subsampling or by filtering. And the other part, the other aspect, which I find it's a sharp knife in the analysis of this signal, is the filtering part. So be very aware of the kind of filter you use, because sometimes it can dramatically change your original signal, and it can distort the pattern or the specific time series you're looking for and you're analyzing. So this part, the filter design, sometimes is underestimated, but it's super important. And I mean, here I put all the references at the bottom, and you will see all the images that are stolen from these papers. But for example, there is this difference between finite impulse response and infinite impulse response, which is particularly critical for the analysis of neurophysiological data.
So basically, when you're doing some reprocessing like this, you need like to have a domain expert included in the pipeline.
Exactly.
It would make it easier.
Yeah.
Easier, but fundamental, because if the reprocessing step introduces some
biases, you're done. I mean, probably the
There's no
interpretation
way to
you get of your results are completely wrong. Yes.
Okay, so what you may want to do is to obtain a representation of your data that is not the original one. So for example, the one that she said before, if you have like a neurological signal, you may want to get the spikes, which are the interesting part. And so we gave a very basic example of this. So if you're analyzing this 3-time series, they kind of look different. But if you look how they are generated, they are basically a signal, which is almost the same. It's like a line, and then there is a sinusoid on it. So what you basically need to represent these 3 signals is just these numbers, which kind of goes in the direction of Fourier transform, which she will explain later. But the point is that if you are able to obtain a representation that is less complicated, it will help in the analysis, and it fully represents your signal or the part that you need. It makes the analysis on the machine learning pipeline or whatever easier. Okay.
Okay. So Fourier transform, why using it? Fourier transform is a transformation which enable us to pass from the time domain to the frequency domain. And it can be particularly convenient for the representation of periodic signals, as Veronica was saying, because if we have some periodic pattern, probably it's much easier if we go to a frequency representation where we can project the original signal in time onto a basis of sine and cosine function. So we can have a representation which is now the one shown in the right, with some coefficients that are related to the specific sinusoid and to specific frequencies. So it represents a good alternative data representation, which can be, I mean, if you want more compressed and more sparse, if you have periodic signals. It's nice because it's a reversible operation, so we can go from the time domain to the frequency domain without losing any kind of information. It's computationally convenient because there are mathematical operations which are easier if performed in the frequency domain. For example, convolution becomes a multiplication in the frequency domain. And it can be also convenient from a mathematical point of view if we want to solve some differential equation. But it has a counter effect, which is the Fourier transform is not an optimal transformation to represent short transient in the signal. And so for this reason, sometimes we prefer other representations. And in this direction, we have wavelet transform. Differently from the Fourier transform, where the basis consists of sine and cosine function of different frequencies, here with wavelets, we fix what we call a mother wavelet, so a signal onto which we will decompose our original data, which is shown on the right in figure B. And it's nicer compared to the Fourier transform because usually what we have when it buys is finite support of the original function. I mean of the mother wavelet. There are also there's a kind of hybrid transform which is pretty local, but it's still in a Fourier flavor, which is the windowed Fourier transform on the left, where instead of projecting onto infinite sine and cosine basis, we multiply first for a window, and this buys a little more locality if we want. But at the same time, this window doesn't change with the frequency, while in the wavelet transform we have the possibility of shrinking the support and at the same time increasing the frequency of the pattern in the support. So there are many possible mother wavelets, so many possible patterns onto which we can decompose the signal, and the choice of this pattern is fundamental because it represents the a priori we have on the signal. So if you want to have a more compressed, I would say, representation, the suggestion is use some pattern that you know it resembles the pattern you're looking for. So yes, last point is the representation is fundamental because it reflects your prior, and at the same time you can have different kind of wavelet transform, like continuous, discrete, and orthogonal discrete. But usually the wavelet transform is for the continuous case, at least, it's a redundant representation. So differently from the Fourier domain, you obtain something which is probably, I mean, there is no single decomposition. You can have multiple decomposition of this. Okay, this goes in the direction of extracting features, especially if you want to do spectral analysis. So what you have is once you obtain this representation, which is in time and frequency, because the wavelet depends on two parameters, you can better visualize your data and you can better understand what's going on. Here in this example, I report the analysis of different patterns where the authors used use continuous wavelet transform to represent the data, and at the same time they make other processing after the wavelets, so normalization and stuff. And the wavelet transform is particularly nice because it allows you to have a representation which enabled you to capture some particular pattern at different frequencies. So you get a better understanding of what's going on in your signal. Okay. So far we have been dealing with representation which we fix a priori. So wavelet, Fourier, in any case we pick a particular basis or a particular pattern and we fix it and we decide to decompose the signal onto these patterns. But we can use also more adaptive methods which go in the direction of learning the best representation from your data instead of picking one in advance. And this goes, I mean, one method that comes in my mind is dictionary learning, where the aim of the dictionary learning is to infer both the coefficients of the representation and the patterns. The standard version of dictionary learning doesn't take into account temporal patterns, so time shifts. So what we see here is that usually we have X, which is a matrix, where in the row there are, each row represents a signal. If you want to see this as a signal, these are acquisition from intracortical data. And in the columns we have time. What we observe is that probably through dictionary learning, what we try to do is to represent the input data as a linear combination of some pattern. In the dictionary learning case, without that doesn't take into account time shifts, this dictionary has the same length in time of the input data. But as you can imagine, this is not convenient for time series. So there are more recent approaches, which are convolutional dictionary learning, for example, where instead of having the product of the two matrices, C and D, the coefficients and the dictionaries, you have the convolution. So you fix the dimension of your patterns, which are called the atoms. And then what you try to find is the recurrence of this pattern into your signal. So for example, this is super simple, but imagine you have a time series of length t, where the t is very large, but at the same time you know that your atoms are super small and they occur in the time series. What you will try to do is to learn an optimal representation, an optimal decomposition, where the patterns are much smaller. This is a free parameter of your algorithm. And what you want to do through convolutional dictionary learning is weighting this pattern along your time series. So again, you solve this problem by minimizing a loss, where usually the loss consists in the difference between these two. And you can impose prior knowledge, which reflects in regularization terms on the dictionary and on the coefficients.
So sorry, the coefficient matrix weights the atoms for each time point.
Yes.
So what are the relation between the dimension of all these matrices?
Okay. Here you have the time. So suppose there is t. Here it depends on the kind of convolution you're performing, but usually if you use, there are different modalities. The one I see usually, which is valid, implies that this matrix has gonna be of length t minus the dimension of the patterns in the dictionary. Well, this is something that you fix depending on your priors. Okay, and here's a particularly interesting approach, which is it's pretty new because the paper was published in December. And the idea is, it was proposed for the analysis of neural data, but I think it could be, it can be interesting also for other cases, because here instead of using a dictionary, it's a multivariate approach, so it's a little bit more different with respect to what we have seen so far, but the most important aspect here is that in the analysis of neural signals, we know probably that we have the activity, one kind of activity that propagates through the entire brain. So probably it makes sense to impose this as a prior knowledge. And the author do this job by asking, the dictionary usually in the multivariate case, it's a big matrix where the number of rows depends on the number of recordings we have. But in this case, instead of having a dictionary which can be full rank, we impose a rank 1 by this term. And the nice thing is that imposing rank 1 means that we are saying to the algorithm, look, probably there's going to be the same pattern spread all over the places. And this buys a lot from the signal to noise ratio point of view, because this was the original signal without putting noise. Here we put noise, And through this method, we are able to recover a signal which is much better than the one we had in input, just because of this constraint, if you want.
Up to now we talked about learning a representation, which is set. It's something that you give a priori or something that you learn from data. There are some cases in which you want to use this representation, in a classification task, in a regression task. So what we want to talk about is methods that allow you to integrate different representations, because maybe you don't know which one is the best, and you want to assess it from data. So let's say that there is a representation that is better for the classification performance, so you want to automatically learn it, automatically understand that that representation is the best, not to learn representation, which is confusing. So for example, if you have temporal data, you may have, I don't know, wavelets. So you have multi-scale coefficients, and you want to integrate all the multi-scale coefficients in a classification task, or you have amplitude similarities or phase similarities, and you want to put everything together. There are many methods that perform that integration. We use multiple kernel learning, which we found nice. Okay, so multiple kernel learning, basically, you have the signal, and you do reprocessing, you learn your representation, and let's say that you code your representation wrong. And you can compute on each of these representations a kernel. So it can be a Gaussian kernel, whatever kernel you like. It can also be a simple X transpose X, if you like. And then you want to put everything together. How do you put everything together? Is basically a summation of the kernel. And there is this nice property that if you impose weights that are positive, the final kernel is still a kernel, so you can use it, in a kernel learning task. And this is nice because if you impose some regularization on the W's, you can, like L1 norm, typically, the methods automatically tells you which are the kernels, and in going backwards, the representation that is more meaningful for your task, for your classification task or learning task. And from that, you can say, fixing this representation, I can do something else, like pattern detection and these kind of things. So this may be useful. This is not really related to what we said before.
Okay.
So another learning method that allows you to understand the data is graph inference. So what we like is that given a set of multivariates, we want to understand the connections between them. Why? Because if you're in a system, like the brain, maybe the signal propagates in a certain way, and you want to understand how the zones in the brain are connected and why, what can you do about it, what can you cure, and something like that. Maybe not true, but I'm not working with brain, so let's take it as it's true. So you have a time series, and you want at each time point, and here it gets tricky because the time point should be discrete, and you have a continuous time series. So what we are saying that is a time point is a short period of time. So we are taking as a single time point a short period of time, and we're saying that how the variables are connected within this short period of time. And then we want to change the time point and see if the connection changes. And if you have a system subject to perturbation, this may help you identify events in your graph, which is basically in your system, because you expect that if these are all connected at some point and something changed, maybe at the next time point, none of them are connected. So something happened, and you can analyze why this happened and what changed and whatever. So we like it. Why? For many reasons.
Sorry, but what was the meaning of these blue lines?
They are the connections between the variables of your system. So basically, you're trying to infer a graph representation of your system, and the variables are the nodes of the graph,
so
and the connections.
You have a connection if the signal of these two
Yes.
variables are the same. In
Yeah,
this,
you're saying that your variables are connected, and you put a graph. And this is just dependency. This is not causation. With our methods, we work with dependency and not causation, because causation generates other problems, which we can discuss in a second time. But yeah, so basically, why we like it is that because it allows us to understand the system, and since it considers the system as an ensemble, we don't have the spheres dependency. Like if we have 3 variables and only there is 2 of them that are connected, we don't get the third edge that is caused by the correlation of the first 2. I don't know if I explain myself. It allows to detect patterns and changing in the time series. It is applicable to many types of data. There are theoretical considerations that you have to do. Generally, the assumption is that the variables are Gaussian, but you can do some tricks to make them Gaussian if you don't have Gaussian variables, so that's nice. And if this is not the case for what I told you, but there are methods that do graph inference that implicitly look for causation between the variables. So you get directed edges in which you say that these variables caused another one, and you can try to understand why this happened and infer something about the system from the structure of the graph.
Okay. So the main take-home messages are first related to the preprocessing part. So keep in mind that the acquisition process is very important, and the better is your understanding of your acquisition system, and probably the better is going to be your analysis in general. So remember to remove to remove artifacts, not preprocessing. Okay, but preprocessing and filtering is something important, which should be handled with caution, because it can harm profoundly your results. And remember that in general, your time series are gonna be noisy by definition. So depending on your acquisition system, depending on the fact that we always deal with noise, keep it in mind and try to use this as an a priori for your models. Last part, more related to machine learning, is that machine learning in general is not a magic wand. So probably if you do at best the first points, your machine learning problem is going to be much easier than at the beginning. So if you want to say the last point.
Yeah.
So when you say artifacts, what do you mean by artifacts?
Okay, by artifacts, probably I'm biased because I always think about neural acquisition, and I think about transient given by noise, which can be present, because I don't know, maybe there are variation in the potential. In my case, I'm working on potential, which are not dependent from the activity, but are dependent from the acquisition system.
Okay, so it's something related to the way you measure the signal.
Exactly. And
yeah, so the last part is like everybody likes machine learning nowadays, but just like try to understand what you're doing, not just take it as a black box, because most of the time it doesn't work, and it's easier for you to understand the data and then apply machine learning than the other way around. Because if you apply machine learning and you get bad results, and in the end, like, what should I do? Like, try to understand the data, and probably it's easier to understand also the method that you should apply on the data.
So as Peter was saying, probably talking with experts in the domain you're dealing with.
Yeah, so like if you want to do pattern detection, it's helpful to understand which are the questions that you're asking. So like which kind of pattern, why do you want to find them, and this kind of thing.
Yeah, and also it's related to like the wavelet transform, the another wavelet. Maybe a domain expert. Like
Yeah, I can suggest a better mother wavelet rather than the usual ones. Can be.
Like for example, Vani is working with this doctor about neural recordings and stuff. And dictionary learning, you can do it having the dictionary fixed. So maybe the doctor could provide some patterns that are meaningful for this disease, and you can try to understand where the pattern happens. And it's easier than understand the pattern from scratch. So, you know, just really understand it. Okay.
Thank you a lot.
Question? So many techniques are broadly applicable. Some of them seem to be a bit more specialized to time series. Can you perhaps comment on which are the special things that you have to do specific for time series? For example, say, if I have an image, I can process it with Fourier transform and Wavelet and do something with it. I can also extract a couple of things and do multiple kernel learning. But there's no time. So where is specifically in the very thing you said, can you point out where time is really
Non-story.
Yeah, there's like where you take advantage, or is that an opportunity or a challenge, I would say?
Okay. I don't know. The challenge, I think, for what I did, well, everywhere. I mean, it's very difficult to analyze time series and not encounter problems of many types.
One thing I see in time series that is not in images, probably, I don't know, but we have never faced in is causation in general. So causal effects that the dynamics, the study of dynamics, that we never deal with seriously. So we always consider representation and search for patterns, but we have never considered this aspect.
It's something that we would like to do, but it's even more difficult. But it's true that if you're analyzing biological systems, it's something that you need time to understand. Like it's never a fixed time point, and that's it. You need the evolving of the system to really understand what is going on.
So I've seen also other approaches where, since they were not considering causation, they were using algorithms, I mean, specialized for image analysis, like convolutional neural nets. So they were transforming the signal in a 2D image, like with the spectral analysis as I shown before, and then they were applying image algorithm.
Yeah, I guess what I have in mind is just that you consider, say, the various timestamp that you have of your time series to be governed by something like a dynamical system.
Exactly.
That is governed by some
mechanism
equation, and then you can try to estimate the parameter evolution equation. Then the times enters from minute 1, because you don't have just a list of numbers that happen to be indexed over time rather than over space, but it's really like a modeling equation.
Yes.
Whereas here, it seems that most things consider time as a parameter.
Yeah.
Suppose that you show me those things, and you just say these are curves over space.
Yeah, it doesn't change anything, I would say.
That was my impression, but I was curious if I was missing something.
No.
It depends on the question you're asking about the data. Like if you're classifying it.
Okay, let me put it. Suppose I take your time series, I replace them, and I actually just put the profile on space.
Okay.
Would you do something different from what you've done? Because I don't give you time anymore, so you cannot use it, right?
For what I've been
Or
doing
you
so
do
far,
roughly the same thing.
I probably would do the same kind of analysis can be proposed in that case. Nothing changes.
Yeah, like graph inference, I don't see it in that case.
Yeah, that's right.
But the other methods you can apply it.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other reason why I never use a causal approach, because the time series I've shown are acquired in a period which is stationary, so nothing is supposed to really happen in that period. So I thought there was no particular causation mechanism, some causal mechanism to study.
The stuff related to causation in the neural activity, for example, is like the correlation between time series that can have like a different time points. So two time series can be correlated if you actually shift one around.
Yeah, they can be correlated, and that's what usually the phase measure is telling you. So if you measure phase shift, and in the brain it happens a lot, then in different region you have connection. Usually it's the best way to infer not structural but functional connectivity between different regions, to consider if you have a phase lag in the signal. If this was the question, I don't know.
Any other question?
One of the problems that I had dealing with time, computation, like doing analysis with continuous signals or with real-time signals, is that you are getting the information, you have to process it as you get it, and you get it incomplete. So for example, as you are getting the EEG reading, either you process it every time you get a new sample, or you might be losing something, not detect something. So the brute force approach is, okay, I process every single, with a sliding window, I process every single sample I get, or maybe I try to detect, so I do some smart pre-processing on the real-time signal to limit the amount of time I lose. Did you have this problem? Or? That's an interesting point. So far, no, because I have these recordings which have been acquired a lot of time ago, and I've been using mostly approaches where the representation was fixed, like Wavelet, so I didn't have to learn the best representation. But what I found out using dictionary learning is that it's extremely computationally expensive. So it's not feasible for, I don't know, 10 minutes acquisitions. And what I'm working on right now is to understand if there are interesting parts. So like with simple thresholds or these kind of approaches, you can think, okay, I have the prior that above a threshold I have something interesting. Let's use it, let's consider that chunk of time, and let's analyze only that part. Because if not, it becomes infeasible. You're right, yes.
Any other question? Okay, we can thank the speakers again.